All right, so I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with my number 8 and go to my number 1.
You have to be different.
I do. Just a little bit. Just a little
Just to be
bit.
heelish.
Exactly, heelish. So my number 8, I'm looking at a time frame, okay, for this number 8 particular, because he morphed into something else in another promotion. But when I look at Axel Rotten as my number 8, as the British Blight, we're talking like 86 to like 92, 93. That's where he did that entire British Blight gimmick. I love that because he could talk, he could walk, he could get people into the arenas. And I thought he did an excellent job getting that character over as a villain, making people hate him. Even though Baltimore loved him. He was a Baltimore native. He was their native son. But he tried his best to make them hate him. And I thought he did great as that. I liked the way that Axel's character looked then. When he got into the tape fist, Taipei matches and all that with Johnny, I understand why they did it. They moved to a different level in ECW. But when I look at the old North Avenue days, the UIW days, the ASWA, the MAWA, Maryland Championship Wrestling, the first incarnation before Dan and Dennis came along, I liked Axel Rotten as a villain. I thought he did good, and I thought he was getting a... And I think that's why he got his cup of tea later in WCW, or at the end of the NWA era.
I like that character. I
too.
probably like that character the best of any of his characters that he did.
I did too.
The British punk rocker
Yes.
type gimmick. I thought that was very strong. And he was very colorful. And his outfits with his leather jackets and his punk haircut
Yes.
and hair coloring.
And you wouldn't know which one he was doing. You know, when TV tapings, it would be pink one time, purple another, then back to blonde.
Very strong talker.
Very strong.
And at that time, due to that character, he did get an opportunity to go to Dallas and work on national TV, ESPN, with the Global Wrestling Federation, where he had a little run with, I think it was Adrian Street.
Adrian Street, right.
And I thought that was a nice little program that they did. And then he had an opportunity with WCW, where he got to work with PN News in 1991 or 92 during that period. And I thought that character transferred pretty well.
Yes.
I just felt sorry that he didn't have more of an opportunity at that time.
Yeah. And again, his character as a villain, to me, stood out. I thought he did.
And you always need a good talker.
Yes.
And he was always a very strong interview.
Well, and that's the thing. They teach you early, the more you can do with talking someone into the seats, the less you have to do in the ring. But when you do it in the ring, it has to be impactful. It can be very small and short. It doesn't have to be some long, drawn-out, incredible thing. But that little bit, if it's impactful, that brings them. And that's
I agree. And I can enjoy a wrestling show that has a good bit of talking, as long as it's good talking.
Good talking.
And it's interesting to me.
Right. And it carries the story forward. And I think he had that.
He did. He really did have a good gift of gab.
Yes.
And he was a fairly good wrestler at that point, where he could do arm drags and work a regular match back and forth with headlocks and hip tosses and tackles and arm drags and that sort of thing. So his timing was good in the ring too.
Yes, I agree.
And his size never seemed to really hurt him. I think that kind of added to the character.
It accentuated it. It did.
Like a more bully type.
Right. It was
throwing his weight around against somebody that was a little bit smaller.
A 300-pound man on a 6-foot frame
that could move
became intimidating, and people saw that, and they're like,
and he didn't mind throwing that weight around and showing that he was a big guy.
Right. I agree. Well, here's, speaking of big guys, my number 7, I think, had we been able to develop more with the UIW, we could have developed this character. Even though he went to Global, even though he went to WWA, even though he went to different promotions throughout the Mid-Atlantic, and is now a big star in Hollywood, I think that with a little bit more, he could have really been developed as an independent wrestler and then moving into the larger organizations. I look at Rasta the Voodoo Man. He needed to be developed, but his character had a great sense of villainy to it. You know, a voodoo practitioner, you could have did so much with that. So I look at the what could have been with Rasta because he had the size. He had the ability if you continue to develop it. Maybe he met his limitations, but that's fine. You don't have to be able to know 1,001 moves like Dean Malenko, as long as you know what you know and you use it. So I don't know that he had ever attained that portion. Imagine this. Imagine that if we went to that feud after Golden Phoenix and Max Thrasher, and that feud ended. What if Waiting in the Wings was them developing Rasta the Voodoo Man, who now was in the feud with Golden Phoenix and he captured his soul, or made Golden Phoenix think that he'd captured his soul, right? What was the Phoenix's gimmick? Rising from the ashes. What if he was able to do something and carry like a bottle around on his neck that was Golden Phoenix essence? Something along those lines. You could have really developed and made that a psychological character that had psychological influence more so than physical influence. That psychological influence could have been the tool, but they didn't develop that potential. And that's the one thing I say. His character did get recreated, though, with Papa Shango. I mean, take a look at the early mag coverage that he had when he was in Global, and next thing you know, Papa Shango shows up in the WWE. So I think with more development, I would have loved to seen that character come out of Rasta.
I could have seen that too. I think we only were exposed to
Very
the
little.
very top layer.
Yes.
But the way that you're explaining it, it would be more like a Kevin Sullivan.
Early Army of Darkness Kevin Sullivan, yes. With Nancy and was it Mark Lewin as the Purple Haze? Exactly.
And Rasta never really had any supporting cast.
No.
That
Other
would
than
have
Kevin,
been,
right.
That would have been interesting.
Exactly. You could have and I think that's what that character needed, that type of development. And if so, think about now that you remember like things like Kevin Sullivan and that. Imagine what we would be thinking and talking about Rasta if they'd have developed that character. It was there. Every bit of it was there.
Maybe as a cult leader type.
Exactly.
That would have been very interesting and a very good take on that character.
Yes. My vision. And I think I look at that as the potential for that villainy. I mean, the physical specimen that Lester is, monster. But you throw that psychological one, and he doesn't have to do as much physically as psychological. There's where your real monster is. What's in the minds and hearts of his opponents.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think they could have done a little bit more in UIW with him wrestling people like Reggie Royce or Bob Wisman or Corey Roberts.
Right.
Where he just physically destroyed them. He never really exploited that physicality to the point where he could have.
Right.
He was a big man and he was strong, but the pure evil and the power behind it was never really portrayed. But I don't think it really had enough time to be portrayed.
No, exactly. It didn't. I mean,
we saw an introduction of the character, and that's all. We got the first chapter of the book.
Right. And it was never written for Nevermore.
And the book was closed.
Right.
I think that's really interesting. I think that's a good choice.
Different choice. Now moving from a supernatural kind of presence into my number 6 is someone who is grounded in the psychology of the South. I look at Jeff Collette as my number 6 and what he did in VWA, what he did for David Lehigh, as someone who was the ultimate villain because he played up the role of villainy so well that it was augmented by his in-ring skills that made you look at him and say, you know what? They gave him the flagship for VWA, and he was able to carry that. And I look at Jeff and I think, great professional, man that knew his job, knew what he was supposed to do, and was able to execute it. I loved him at the beginning of his matches where he would get into the opponent's head and do the push-ups and the jumping jacks and at the beginning of almost like he was warming up in front of them, those types of things. So very much so involved with the psychology of the story itself. That's what I liked about Jeff.
Interesting. I did like his work in UIW as a Southern Gentleman.
Right.
And when he was part of the tag team of Dixie Devastation, I thought he did a very good job at that.
Yes. He became the glue. Where Bubba was the glue before him, Jeff stepped in and became the glue.
I think he even held it together better than Bubba. It seemed like when Bubba was part of the team, it was two separate individuals.
Right.
And it seemed more of a coordinated effort when he became part of the tag team.
No, I agree.
And he was very good at it as
the
well.
continuity was there.
And he was so good at stepping into someone else's shoes like that
Right.
with hardly any notice at all. There was no transition. It just, overnight, there was a new member of that tag team.
Yeah.
And I thought he did a very good job
He did.
stepping into that
And the good thing was when Ed Zahn called him up and said, "Hey, we got this position up here." He stepped into a feud with the Cream Team, who he'd already been feuding with, and knew Sid and Dave's style. So, I mean, good transition.
It seemed seamless.
Right, it did. It absolutely did. Now I'm going to look at my number 5, and I'm going to look at it. Folks are going to recognize the name right away, but I'm going to look at it back in his early days in the 70s. Especially up in the Pacific Northwest, what I'll talk about later, Pacific Northwest. Comes to prominence, people get a chance to see him a lot more in the AWA than in the WWF. I'm talking about Buddy Rose. Talk about a villain that drew money, but was always overlooked when it come to New York. And then Minneapolis or Minnesota, he had a period of shine there, especially with him and Doug Summers. All the way around, what a great performer. What a great villain. Someone who could actually draw money and bring people in. Buddy Rose. Absolutely excellent, in my opinion.
Playboy Buddy Rose.
Yes.
One of the really big draws in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's what I look at, that portion of it.
That portion of it. Although, back in 1985 and 1986, when the AWA was very thin on talent, he played a very big role there with his tag team with Doug Summers and being paired up with Sherry Martel.
Right.
They had a really well-received feud with
the Rockers.
Midnight Rockers.
Right. Cage match is still one of the shining epithets on the AWA's grave marker, if you think about it.
And at that time, too, he was probably pretty well past his prime.
Yeah. But he could still go. He could still do it.
He could talk. He was such a good talker.
Yep.
Even though they made a parody of him later in the WWF when he came back in the early 1990s, despite being given a terrible gimmick with the blow-away diet,
right,
he still got over with it.
Oh, he made it work.
He made it work. He made a terrible, stupid premise work.
Exactly.
So that just tells you how great he was.
Right. It underscores the underrated portion of him. And again, you look at the money draw. The guy was drawing money. He was making money. The feuds that he was doing in the Pacific Northwest.
Even early 1980s when he came to the Northeast and was working with Bob Backlund and Pedro Morales.
Oh, yes. Yes, you're right.
What a great talent and what good matches that he would have with them. At that point in time, when he came out to the ring, he was very hated, very unlikable. You could just tell the fans didn't care for him at all. And that was his job, and he did a great job with it.
Underscoring his villain's role. So my number 4 is really like a three-headed monster, but it's almost like the three-headed Godfather monster. And when I say what I'm going to say, the first thing that popped in my mind when I thought about these guys was what Bill Apter had to say about them in a feud that these guys had gotten into, and it was something along the lines of I've seen the future of professional wrestling, and it is the ultra violent style. Right? I think Scar Wars was the documentary that these guys were in. And I'm talking about none other than Larry Winters, DC Drake, Johnny Hotbody. I look at those three guys. Now, even though some of them they actually all became faces, it was like a rotation of heel to face, heel to face. They all went through that, and they all feuded with each other, and they really put the TWA, right? Joel Goodhart's TWA, as a household name through the creativity that they were doing in Philadelphia. So I look at Larry Winters, DC Drake, Johnny Hotbody in that rotating role as my fourth favorite villains to watch, to see, even though they did different iterations of, I'm a heel today, face tomorrow. So I look at that and I think to myself, wow, what an incredible transition that made you love and hate, where you bring the fans up and down, give them that roller coaster through those constant changes like that.
I always liked DC Drake.
Mm-hmm.
I thought he was very good in the NWF and when he was feuding with Jules Strongbow.
Oh, yes.
And at that point, Jules Strongbow was probably on the downhill side of his career. And he really took that feud and made something out of it.
Yes.
Especially in the Pennsylvania area, around Reading and Philadelphia area. They had a nice little feud going. And the blood and the guts and the craziness. I think Bruiser Brody even got caught up in that feud too there with DC Drake. So it was really a wild, crazy feud with chain matches and steel cages.
Stretcher matches.
All that sort of thing. Blood. Stuff like that wasn't commonplace at that point in time. I think he did a real good job with that. And then later, when he was in Joel Goodhart's TWA, when they paired him up with Woman and Donnie Allen.
Oh, right.
I thought he did a really, really good job. He really carried that side of the promotion for Joel's TWA.
Yes. Yep. I agree with you. Need to look back and see that as well.
It was interesting, too, how the characters evolved. At one point, Drake and Winters were feuding with each other.
Right.
And then later on, they became tag team partners.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yes, sir.
This is a list of the top 8. Mm-hmm. I think you're being a little bit heelish and cheating.
Yeah.
By including 3 people
in one. Well,
I don't think that's fair.
Well, tit for tat there, Mr. Slide a tag team in there.
I think I'm okay with a tag team. But
because it was one entity?
We're really stretching it when we include 3 people in one spot. Believe me, I've taken notice to this, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think you were holding the tag rope when you tagged in properly.
Oh. Well, all I could say was Dave the Wave's back was turned, so I put that in there.
Dave, we need you. I think we need an official ruling. I think he got one over on us.
A quick one. Slide it in at number 4, add 3 together, all of a sudden.
Confuse everyone. Number 4, including 3 people.
Right, so now my 8-person list is an 11-person list. I love it. That's true villainry right there.
I think that is stretching the rules just a little.
Well, he did catch me, but I can make it up because you put my number 3 was very high on your list too. So I think that we are very symbiotic on the same page with this person.
Oh, so now we're going to get back on the same page.
Yes.
We'll be good again. Okay.
Yes. Make everything nice.
Okay.
So I look at my number 3 as King Kalua. Mike Kalua, I know we've talked about him already, but I can't say enough about him. His work in the AWA, where he worked Nick Bockwinkel, when he moved up into ICW for the Savoldies, and he's been everywhere, done everything. He's worked with all the Godfathers. He is one of the Godfathers of what we've come to understand as the independents. I mean, so how much more can you say about that man other than he is a classic villain that did his job, did it well, and deserves the recognition of everyone in this profession of what he's done. I think he's done an excellent job.
Now, who did you like King Kalua working with best?
Oh, there's only one person because it traveled so well. Whether it was in Boston, whether it was in Philly, whether it was in Maryland, whether it was in Virginia, whether it was overseas, you know, Tom Brady. There is no Mike Kalua. There is no King Kalua without the Tom Brady. You have to have that both sides of it. And I think that match is a staple and always was a staple no matter where it was that put the epitome of professional wrestling in that one confined four corners of that squared circle, so to speak. King Kalua versus Tom Brady. There was no way around it. That is on an all-time list. If we ever did one of those, that match goes on an all-time list of any promotion.
Oh, I agree. And what a great job that they did on that very first win card
Yes.
in Dundalk. And it was an Eye of the Hurricane match.
Yes.
What a great job. And I believe King Kalua was filling in for
Scotty. Yeah.
Scotty the Body
Scotty
that
the
night.
Body, yes.
And no one
Expected it.
expected an Eye of the Hurricane match between those two. And it was so good.
Yep.
And no one missed Scotty the Body.
Well, and Ed Zahn did
because
it right.
was so good.
Right, and it was, but Ed Zahn did it right too. Scotty just didn't no-show. Scotty was part of the angle. If you remember, there was a telephone call that they recorded and they played for the audience of Scotty, you know, explaining what was going on. And then the next thing you know, Kalua is there sliding in, and it erases the memory of, you know, what was to be to what is happening now. I agree with you 100%.
You couldn't have picked someone better to fill in. That was
No.
a great match. And it was a little bit different from their norm because we threw out some different rules
Right.
that night. And it was interesting and it was good. And the fans were certainly behind it the whole way. And no one left at the end of the night thinking, wow, I didn't get what I paid for.
Right, exactly, 100%. Speaking about what you paid for, if you ever laid your money on the line and put a bounty out on someone, my number 2 always collected that bounty because he was the bounty hunter. You've talked about him.
Oh,
Max Thrasher,
yes.
What a great villain. What an absolute great villain. Could talk, could walk, could fight, could rough it up, could technical it up, could do anything with you. The look of him, intimidating, excellent, excellent. One of the best villains, like I said, I've ever seen anywhere. The psychology behind it, he knew it not only in the ring side of it, the side of it as the promoter, as a booker, as a storyteller. He could do it for himself and for other people. I mean, that is something that is the quintessential, for me, heel, because he knows every aspect of it. And when he comes into the room, he commanded presence. You know, and it was just he had a commanding presence, and the respect just immediately went to him. Max Thrasher, the bounty hunter. Wow.
And I'm not a fan of wrestlers who wear blue jeans into the ring, but it fit his character perfectly. He was different from everybody else.
Yep.
He was kicking butt, taking names, and he was legitimately tough.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to try and test him. I think everybody in the building knew, don't mess with him because he'll mess you up.
No, exactly. What an excellent guy. What an excellent, excellent worker. But he's only my number 2.
Number 2?
Right.
He was my number 1.
So my number 1 is a very devious character. Notorious anywhere he went. Scandal and mayhem followed him. Whether it was the UWF, not Herb Abrams UWF, but the UWF,
Bill
Watts style, whether it was down in WCCW, whether it was in Continental, whether it was in ECW, anywhere he went, it followed him because of who he was. And he wrestled for the MEWF, MCW, all the local promotions as well. And I'm talking about Eddie Gilbert. Think about everything that followed. Now, I'm not talking about his personal demons. That's off the table. We're talking about his villainry as a character. I don't know too many more devious people and a person who personified a heel more so than Eddie Gilbert. Did he have every angle of that down?
Well, when you consider that he tried to run over Jerry Lawler with a car in the parking lot.
Oh, and I didn't even mention Memphis.
And the
you're right.
police were called. I'd certainly have to agree. One of the great all-time.
Yes. And I think wherever he went, controversy followed, mayhem, scandal, everything that made him such a great villain. I mean, Roddy Piper, when he traveled, like he northwest in the Pacific Northwest, and what later became, I think, like Portland and those types of things. Wherever he went, it followed him as well. But I like looking at Eddie Gilbert because of all the Southern things that were done with that storytelling. That when you put it with his devious nature, became that toxic mixture that was great, but it was also bad because you infused it, and there were some things that happened.
Just think about the time when he aligned himself with the Russians,
right,
and put the flag over Bill Watts.
Exactly.
I mean, talk about red hot.
Right.
Yes, and his pairing with Missy Hyatt.
Perfect.
Red hot in a different type of way.
Right. Well, and I think with putting Jack Tatum on his roster, his stable, those types of things, and surrounding himself wherever he went with a stable,
Not only a wrestler, but sometimes serving as like a manager.
Exactly. So that would be my list. He would top my list for a lot of reasons, but every time I think of Eddie, I think of that villainry. I only got to meet him, I think, 2 different times for the MEWF, but he was a person that you could talk to, and I thought just listening to, and that's what you do, you listening to the things that he was discussing and the way that he was discussing it made an indelible mark to me that said, wow, that cat, not only do I see it, but listening backstage, that cat's got it going on. He knows what he's doing and knows how to do it.
Just the mayhem that he would stir up. I mean, he was so incredible at what he did. The fire throwing.
Right.
Right. And he was so smart. Not only about his matches, but his political stance on things. He made himself such a centerpiece of the promotion at times that if he'd have a difficult time with a promoter or the front office, he'd leave and the bottom would drop out.
Yep.
It's just amazing. Great all round.
Yes. Well, Tim, the Great 8. This is only the first part of this 2-part episode, right? We've only talked about our top 8 villains.
Or top 11.
Something caught there in the crawl?
Something caught in my crawl there, a little.
The extra 3 I slid in there?
Something like that.
But this is only part 1, right?
It's a new math, right?
Yes. It was Common Core. That's Common Core math. Anyway, back to the topics on hand. This is only our first part. We still have another great 8 episode portion to do. And I promise I will stick to 8 on this one. So if our friends join us next week, we'll go to the second portion of this, and we're going to talk about our top great 8 promotions, indie/territory.
I'll be counting.
I'm hoping that you will. So friends, I hope you've enjoyed our retro look at the villains that we've put in an ascending or descending order, however you want to look at it, our top 8. We're hoping that you add yours that maybe we missed on our list. So write in. Send some video in. Say, hey, what about this? Blues, Walker, you forgot these things. These people. We would love to hear from that. What do you think, Tim?
I think so.
So, if you don't mind doing that, we'd love it. We're hoping that you join us next week for another stroll down Concussion Lane as we continue our 2-part Season 8 intro with another Great 8 look.
I'm counting on it.
At our top 8 promotions.